Thank you all so much for coming out today. I'm Jill Ross, Director of the Center for Comparative Literature, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our lecture today. It's our first of two Northrop Frye lectures in theory this year. And originally this lecture series was set up to honor the legacy of Northrop Frye, who founded the program in comparative literature at the University of Toronto in 1969, a program that later became institutionalized as the Center for Comparative Literature and was the first home of the discipline in Canada. The visiting professorship was set up early on in Frye's name and has been occupied by eminent theorists, only some of whom were aligned with Frye's vision of literary theory and criticism. Now, Frye wasn't bothered by this, quipping to Frederick Jameson, who was the holder of the professorship at the time. Frye said, "It doesn't matter how often I'm mentioned by other critics. I form part of the subtext of every critic worth reading," end quote. Now, I mentioned Frederick Jameson, and I want to take this opportunity to speak about Frederick Jameson for a moment. As you know, he died a few days ago on September 22nd at the age of 90. He was the Center's Northrop Frye professor during the academic year of 1977-78, which seems like a long time ago. He delivered a series of lectures while he was here, which were all recorded, audio only, and are available on our website through a link to our YouTube channel. These lectures, I encourage you to listen, by the way. It's really illuminating. These lectures form the basis of his important book, The Political Unconscious, that he wrote here while in residence at the Center, a book that continues to inform the research and teaching of faculty and students here at the Center and around the world. He was a mentor and model whose sharp theoretical insights made him a towering figure in our discipline. Like Frye, Jameson and all holders of the Frye professorship take theory seriously and look beyond the interpretation of specific texts to the broader theoretical concerns of literature, culture, history, politics, ethics, and aesthetics. I'm so pleased today to welcome Professor Tithi Bhattacharya from Purdue University's Department of History to this position today, the latest in a long list of theorists ranging from Jameson to Kristeva, Walcott to Taylor. I'm not going to read them all, but it's a very eminent list. Professor Bhattacharya today will be speaking on social reproduction theory as diagnostic, abolition as politics, reimagining anti-capitalism. Now, before I turn the floor over to Labiba Naeem, one of our doctoral students at the Center, to introduce Professor Bhattacharya's work and career, I want first to acknowledge the indigenous land upon which this lecture takes place. So I wish to acknowledge, or we wish to acknowledge, this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Thank you. So,
Hi, good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture by Professor Tithi Bhattacharya, titled Social Reproduction Theory as Diagnostic, Abolition as Politics, Reimagining Capitalism. It is my honor to introduce the speaker. Professor Tithi Bhattacharya is an associate professor of history and director of global studies at Purdue University. Her publications include Ghostly Past, Capitalist Present, and Sentinels of Culture, Education, and the Colonial Intellectual in Bengal. She has contributed to collections focused on colonial India, as well as the issue of apartheid in relation to Palestine. She is the editor of Social Reproduction Theory, Remapping Class, Recentering Oppression. She has also co-authored Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto. Her work on modern South Asian history touches on provocative and important questions related to gender, class formation, and coloniality. Her work on religious communalism and the issue of Islamophobia is especially relevant in relation to the ongoing genocide in Palestine. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tithi Bhattacharya.
Good evening, and thank you so much for that kind introduction, Labiba. And thank you to Jill and the Department of Comparative Literature for inviting me. The most unknown in a series of very, very renowned professorial names. So I am really, really honored to be here. When I got this invitation, this very kind invitation, I'm a historian who had just heard of Northrop Frye, so I of course researched him, and the most amazing thing that I found out, besides his theoretical contribution, is that Northrop Frye was very much against the war in Vietnam, and he was an activist and an active protester of the South African apartheid. So much so that the Canadian equivalent of the US FBI had to open a file on Northrop Frye. So that is a great honor for me to stand here talking to you, because like Northrop Frye, before I begin my talk, I want to acknowledge an ongoing genocide in now a whole year of it, and I want to remember my brothers and sisters and all our children in Palestine and now Lebanon. Some of you I spoke with before the talk began, and many of you said that you didn't know what social reproduction theory was. And so I have this little introduction, and many of you will know what I'm talking about, but many of you may not. So social reproduction is social reproduction theory, or SRT as we like to call it, is about the social reproduction of labor power under capitalism. So labor power is not quite labor. Marx makes a distinction. Labor power is our capacity to labor, right? So the capacity in this, this is a very effective diagram, and it was part of the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. So it shows you what is necessary before the worker arrives at the workplace, right? So if the work hour is from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., increasingly more than that, but if the work hour is from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., then social reproduction theory is what happens before 9 a.m. and what happens after 5 p.m., right? So what kind of resources does the worker need to renew their labor power before they go back to work? So in here you see these very willing partners, women, tending to the tired worker before they go into the factory. But social reproduction theorists like me also extend this renewal of labor power not just within the home, but also outside the home. So for instance, a child going to school or a young adult going to university is where their labor power is not necessarily getting renewed, but getting trained so that they can apply for jobs. So now you can imagine an entire infrastructure of dispossession that we can think of, which is the person who does not have a home, so the place of renewal is not available to them. The person who doesn't have the resources to go to university, then their labor power is at a lesser price on this terrible market than the labor power of some of us who were fortunate to go to university. Those of us who did not go to Oxford or Cambridge, our labor power costs less. So you can see how if we start tracing labor power, then we can sort of follow this sort of thread of where privilege and dispossession can arise or disappear. So that's sort of briefly what we mean by social reproduction of labor power. Now, I'm going to start this paper talking about something that the very, very right-wing Indian government launched recently. The word portion roughly translates to care in multiple Indian languages. I say roughly because other meanings lie seeded in the word: foster, support, nutrition being some of them. The multiple meanings no doubt trail in with them histories of practice indicating the protean nature of care work in general. So it was with a certain ingenious flair that the far-right Indian government named their care work tracker app Portion. Introduced in 2021, the app is supposed to revolutionize care work by monitoring in real time the number of functioning childcare centers with working toilets and drinking water, the number of people who receive government-sponsored take-home cooked meals, and also nutritional outcomes for children. So if you look here, you can see on the right-hand side data entry, and that's where care workers have to enter their data. What the government websites extolling the virtues of the app do not mention are the following: that care workers' pay is linked to how much data they manage to upload, including how many hours they work. And further, that in a country like India, where many childcare workers do not own a smartphone and have at best uncertain access to the internet, the onus is on the workers to provide themselves with the technologies. Since the welcome renewal of scholarly and political attention on care and social reproduction, there has also been an unspoken ahistoricization of care as intrinsically beautiful, even virtuous expression of human labor. Undoubtedly, care by humans of other beings and the earth ought to be, as an apocryphal comment attributed to Margaret Mead notes, a mark of civilization, end quote. Care in this expansive sense also ought to be the organizing principle of any future society we imagine, socialist or otherwise. Care, as practiced within capitalism, however, like many institutions and practices under capitalism, is a dialectical unity of opposites. On the one hand, it constitutes a stubborn, intractable aspect of humanity that refuses capitalist modification, continuing to support and sustain life forms. On the other, as an act inserted into capitalist social relations, and part of it, it can be limited in its welfare functions. Social reproduction theory, or SRT, that studies the social relations through which human beings create, maintain, and generate labor power, is concerned with both these dimensions of labor power under capitalism. For in this system, labor power is both inseparable from a living, breathing human being, as well as an exploitable commodity. Here, for the purposes of this talk, it is important to note that while all care work certainly constitutes the social reproduction of labor power, the way social reproduction as a theoretical concept is employed in the literature denotes more than simple acts of care. It includes in its remit institutions ranging from profit-making childcare companies, loving attention given to a child by their mother, to certain aspects of even the capitalist state. This imbricated relationship between capitalism and social reproduction is the subject of much recent feminist scholarship. Take, for instance, my comrade Premila Naderson's excellent new book, Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where the very title helps us orient to her analysis. Naderson urges us to consider the, quote, shocking and grotesque, unquote, ways in which, quote, human survival has become a means for capitalist growth in deindustrializing countries, unquote. Like most of her past work, the new book is both a rich historical survey of private organizations such as Maximus that allows state child welfare agencies to maximize revenues, the carceral logic inherent in US government programs like SNAP, which criminalizes the poor, as well as a map of institutions and organizations that practice radical care, such as those working in the Black food justice movement, indigenous organizations such as Red Nation, and the exceptional disability rights group Since Invalid. I find much to learn and agree with these interventions in the field of social reproduction studies, if it can be called that. The reliance of this scholarship on racial capitalism as a lens to illustrate how paid social reproduction was and still is tied to racialized class power is particularly powerful. Importantly, these interventions do not conflate waged work with unpaid labor, thereby emphasizing both capital's dependence on multiple forms of work, not just wage work, as well as the versatility of the process of accumulation, which draws whatever is available into its orbit. Thus, when Naderson, for instance, writes that paid labor of social reproduction is predicated on racialized and class power that is sutured to the legacy of slavery, immigration, forced labor, settler colonialism, and imperialism, my response is wholehearted agreement. There are some debates still, and I want to signpost those, amongst social reproduction feminists as to how we conceive of the relationship between unwaged social reproduction labor and waged social reproduction labor. Note that the existence of the former unwaged social reproduction labor is not undisputable experientially, but also explicable theoretically. It is the relationship between the two, unwaged and waged social reproduction, that I am concerned with in this talk, and its implications for a politics of resistance and solidarity. So unwaged and waged labor, how do we untangle it? there are two interrelated components to this conversation amongst feminists. One about the definition of productive labor, and the second about the status of domestic labor. And it is important not simply to attend to both, but to show how the second is a consequence of the first. Productive labor, specific to the capitalist mode of production, is defined by Marx as labor which produces surplus value. And I will ask all of you theorists to go to Capital Volume 1, and I won't bother to read out the entire quote about valorization. Discussions about productive and unproductive labor under capitalism are neither new nor first conceptualized by SRT scholars like me. As early as 1912, the difference between the two are sharply drawn by Rosa Luxemburg. And here I will quote, because we all love Rosa. As long as capitalism and the wage system rule, only that kind of work is considered productive which produces surplus value, which creates capitalist profit. From this point of view, the music hall dancer whose legs sweep profit into her employer's pocket is a productive worker, whereas all the toil of the proletarian women and mothers in the four walls of their homes is considered unproductive. This sounds brutal and insane, but corresponds exactly to the brutality and insanity of our present capitalist economy, unquote. Two important questions arise from Luxemburg's insight. First, it is clear that unwaged labor does not create profit, but can there be wage labor that also does not create profit? Second, which category of labor does care work fall into? Let us pause here and unpack both, but a preparatory remark before we begin. This debate can sometimes be confusing because the word value has both a literal meaning and a Marxist technical meaning. In the literal meaning, to say something has value denotes to it a positive sense of being valuable. I value all my friends who are here. Some feminists can, of course, rightly get irate at being told that domestic labor has no value, because it is taken then to be valueless. But when social reproduction feminists, or some of us, claim that domestic labor has no value, we mean it in the Marxist technical sense, meaning such labor does not have exchange value. So not value in the literal sense, but exchange value in the technical sense. Oh dear. Okay. Did I do something wrong? No. Room PC. Okay, there we go. Right. So Marx himself is quick to point out that under capitalism, to be a productive worker, i.e. to make value, is, I quote, not a piece of luck, but a misfortune, unquote. In other words, domestic labor, as Luxemburg's comment also shows, is extremely valuable. Indeed, it is a precondition for the production of surplus value, but it only has use value, not exchange value. So let me chart quickly the genealogies of the different kinds of social reproduction labor, and make a case for their diversity of form, function, and political possibilities. So the main contention here is that domestic labor is often unwaged, and all unwaged labor, domestic or otherwise, is impossible to generalize and abstract across its multiple production units, or households in this case. What does that mean? The principle of the labor theory of value in Marx, which we follow, which we work with, is that in a capitalist economy, the law of value determines how labor is allocated between the branches of production. I write labor, but this is not the concrete labor of the actual worker, rather it is the abstract labor produced and mediated through the process of exchange. And a constantly shifting equilibrium is maintained between the production units because the value of labor power and the means of production changes when there's a change in the exchange ratios. Marx theorizes labor power as a commodity, but calls it unique because, unlike other commodities, it produces more value than itself. To this, we can add one more feature, that unlike chairs or toothbrushes, the commodity form of labor power does not impinge on its processes of production. The performance of unwaged domestic labor is independent of the exchange value dynamic. So, in other words, if one of you start a toothpaste factory tomorrow in order to fight Colgate, and you decide to offer toothpastes at $1 Canadian or even free, then you will soon be, the law of value, the way it operates in the market, this is, I'm simplifying, you will soon be out of business, okay? Now, in the case of the domestic labor, however, what is the product? The commodity is labor power, right? Domestic labor creates the commodity labor power, right? And labor power has to be sold on the market. But it doesn't impinge on what I do at home. So, in other words, if I don't make beds, if I don't cook, if I don't do anything, you still have to sell your labor power in the market. Reversely, if I make more superior beds than Jill here, or my house is cleaner than some of you here, my labor power is independent of that, okay? So beds still have to be made, food cooked, and children fed. That's the other thing. You've just got to feed a child, okay? Yeah, otherwise they'll die. So it doesn't matter what you do, you still have to do that, irrespective of how that labor power is sold in the market. Also, think about the Colgate and your little lovely toothpaste factory, okay? So again, the reason you're priced out of the market is because of how much quantity you produce and at what price you're selling it, right? But in other words, you're competing with Colgate to put your product in the market. But I am not competing with the mamas who are here in the room when it comes to changing diapers, okay? I might change my kid's diaper once a day, poor child. You might be a better mama and change the diaper the minute it gets wet, but that has no effect on how that child's labor power will be sold in the market, and so I cannot be competing. So if the production unit is the household, which it is of labor power, then the production units are not competing with each other. In other words, there is no law of value in operation. Does this kind of make it clear? Great. So further, there is no socially necessary labor time for household chores, say breastfeeding or changing diapers. A commodity's value, according to Marx, is determined by the socially necessary labor time going into production. If a chair or a toothpaste is valued at X, it is not because of the time I, who know nothing about chairs or toothpaste, take to make it. So in other words, I can take, for me with a chair, it'll be probably a year before I make a chair. So that is not the socially necessary labor time of making that chair. The socially necessary labor time is the average of all the chair makers who actually make chair that takes to make the chair. So in a capitalist economy, X is determined by the amount of labor time performed by a worker working with the average level of technology and average level of skill. So there again you see the average level of technology in one country will be very different from the average level of technology in another country. So there again you see discrepancies kind of creeping in. Production units or homes, in this case, therefore do not compete with each other in order to make the production process more efficient. This is particularly significant given the continuous introduction of labor-saving devices into the home. However much I would like to shorten my cooking time after a day at work, I do not do so because I'm competing with Naima, my neighbor. If I take longer than Naima, that is, I am more inefficient, this does not mean I fail to place my or my family's labor power in the market. The concrete form of unwaged domestic labor thus does not assume the character of abstract social labor in the Marxist sense, even though the product, which is labor power, does. If unwaged domestic labor, while being valuable, does not produce surplus value, what about waged social reproduction labor? And here our common sense is, well, it's waged, so it must produce surplus value. Maybe. Increasingly, social reproduction labor in general and domestic labor in particular is being performed by waged labor. There is now an excellent and growing body of scholarship that draws attention to this now global phenomenon, one that Sarah Ferris has succinctly described as, quote, care as alienated as well as racialized and exploitative labor, unquote. It is becoming distressingly common in the global north for the child care and elder care industry, to even call it industry is disgusting, to be dominated by private equity firms. Nor is the phenomenon limited to the global north. Scholars such as Elena Baglioni and Alexandra Misadri have carefully tracked the informalized sector in the global south and attended to the devastating effects of the commodification of care, a development that as early as 1997, Claire Anderson beautifully defined as the marketization of intimacy. If corporations, both large and small, now dominate the global care sector and determine its needs, policy, and methods of labor discipline, then can we argue that, as some of the feminists like Madison does, that the care economy has now turned social reproduction into a profitable product in itself? Herein lies the fulcrum of some of the debates in the field. Some scholars, like Misadri, see social reproduction as a source of profit and there to be no inherent tension between social reproduction and capital accumulation. While others like me and Susan Ferguson from right here in Toronto argue that social reproduction does not create profit or surplus value. Much hinge on this disagreement, so let me lay out some of the key components. First, for reasons I try to show, it is some unwaged domestic labor that does not create profit, not social reproduction labor as such. All labor, social reproduction or not, that goes through the very specific mechanics showed in this slide creates surplus value or profit. So it doesn't matter if the labor goes through this circulation, it doesn't matter whether it's social reproduction labor, care labor, or not, if it goes through this circuit, then it produces profit. The point is not to ask if domestic labor or social reproduction labor creates profit, for it is neither the form of the labor nor the site where it is performed that determines the issue, but the process that it undergoes in both its execution and outcome. Some domestic labor does not create profit, for it does not go through the above exchange mechanism. Me kissing my child, feeding my child, being better about changing my child's diapers. The example of my neighbor Naima and I cooking meals for our family is a case in point. Naima may buy a more efficient oven, food processor, while I may still be using old models, but the time Naima saves is not in correlation to me. Her efficiency in this case has no effect either on her own product or on mine, in the narrow Marxist technical sense. Of course, it does make life infinitely easier for Naima. Some domestic labor, however, even when performed for a wage, is still not productive labor according to this definition, i.e. it still does not produce surplus value even though it's care work and it has a wage. So let's think of some examples. When the rich housewife in Delhi employs the migrant woman from Bangladesh or Nepal, albeit for a low wage, that labor may be waged. Housewife is paying the migrant worker, but it is still not productive because those wages are not part of variable capital and hence does not go on to add value to valorize capital. In other words, wage workers themselves can purchase unproductive labor just like capitalists, and when they do so, they're acting not as capitalists but as consumers. Okay? So, other people who do care work and are waged but do not produce value are state employees, teachers teaching in government schools whose services are purchased with revenue, not profit, belong in this category. But when we consider a teacher at a private for-profit school, the designation changes to productive labor or labor that's creating value. So it's not about teaching, but it's about where the teaching is taking place and what process the labor undergoes. So this is the exchange value kind of chart. Every productive worker then is a wage worker, but not every wage worker is a productive worker. Contrary to common sense understanding of capitalism, then labor can be broadly defined as care work, both waged and unwaged, and this labor can fall into multiple categories. To recap, care may be 1, unwaged and not produce surplus value or profit, such as when I do my laundry in my own home. Waged and still not produce surplus value and profit, such as when someone else who is not employed by a mega cleaning company does the same labor in my home. So again, if I hire a migrant worker, pay them low wages, they're not part of this sort of mega cleaning company or whatever. They're getting paid to do care work, but it's still not producing value. Finally, waged and produce care work can be waged and produce surplus value when the person doing my laundry comes from a for-profit maid service, whatever that means. They are all capitalist forms of labor, even though some produce surplus value and others do not. Social reproduction feminism is distinctively positioned to explain this multi-layered laboring world because, and here I quote my friend and colleague Susan Ferguson, quote, instead of foregrounding abstract systems of oppression and a narrow preoccupation with gendered work, social reproduction feminism is uniquely equipped to center analysis on a much broader conception of labor, one that accommodates its inflection by multiple intersecting social relations. And it is to these intersecting social relations that I turn to next. In order to make life a little easier for generations of students starting with Capital Volume 1, if I was allowed to add a note to the first 5 chapters, this is what I would say. That capitalism does not just produce the commodity, it also produces the class or social relations that maintain the system as a whole. Such a statement would set the text up in some key ways. The edit, for instance, would help orient the reader to the fact that there exists a set of structural dimensions to the capital-labor relationship, irrespective of relationships between an individual worker and their employer. For it is not until, alas, chapter 23 that Marx notes that the working class, quote, even when it stands outside the direct labor process, is still an appendage of capital, unquote. But you have to wait till chapter 23. What does this mean for social reproduction, beyond the banality that even social reproductive labor, in all its forms, is an expression sometimes of capitalist social relations? The answer to this question unfolds a doubling. On the one hand, social reproduction labor is certainly a part of capitalist social relations. But on the other hand, since its product is a human being, or life itself, it has certain unique dimensions. For selling labor power is different from selling stock or a widget. To the first, capital has certain fundamental tendencies that it tries to impress upon social life in general. Speed up and quantification are thus recurrent forms imposed upon all wage labor, wage social reproduction labor being no exception. If portion workers in India, as we saw, are forced to adopt tracking apps, hospital management in the US impose unsafe speed-ups on nurses by increasing the number of nurses per patient and demanding more overtime. Like, treat your patients like you treat cars, just one after the other, please. Similarly, I've written about this elsewhere, teaching as a profession globally has seen a rapid tailorization of education where teachers are increasingly de-skilled and their work, the effort is to break it down into meaningless but discrete commodifiable parts. While these distressing practices of valorization are widespread, these disciplines, however, contain their own contradictions. For, to repeat, care work produces people, not cars. Social reproduction struggles thus often erupt in these places when faced with that sort of speed up, okay? And these social reproduction struggles can be identified by their political expansiveness. When care workers, whether they're productive or not is irrelevant here, challenge the circuits of value generation, the aims of this struggle often spill over their stated category. For instance, the women's strike in Iceland in 1975 began as a wage strike or workplace strike against gendered wage discrepancy, but soon grew to be a complete withdrawal of women's labor in the home as well as at work. Correspondingly, when teachers go on strike, they seek to work with churches and community organizations to continue to provide midday meals to their pupils who would have received that food at school. By pushing across spatial and formal boundaries, care struggles reveal the gap between capitalist subject formation and the rich potential of human subjectivity. And my colleague and co-editor on Spectre Journal, Aaron Jaffe, has a wonderful essay on social reproduction struggles that I would direct you to. This is why I believe anti-racist analysis like abolition can be a powerful complement to social reproduction theory. So my next section is SRT and abolition. Like all developments under capitalism, the commodification of social reproduction involves a bricolage of new forms of domination and in reliance on older ones. We owe scholars of race and ethnicity a debt of gratitude for theorizing these combinatory moves of capital with concepts such as conjugated oppression. Such concepts powerfully demonstrate how non-class modes of domination are employed to shape class formations and exploitation. In China, for instance, the ancient hukou system of household registration is mobilized by bosses to cheat migrant workers of their wages. Phenomena such as this, where older forms of oppression are amplified and changed by new forms of exploitation, gets us to the heart of abolition as method. Consider the definition of abolition politics as outlined by one of its clearest and most creative theorists, Ruth Wilson Gilmore. At the very outset of her now classic work on the California prison complex, Gilmore powerfully illuminates the connection between social reproduction or care in a narrow sense and incarceration. The prison system in California could explode in the post-war era precisely because, as Gilmore demonstrates, California could and chose to reorient the capacities of its state from welfare functions, so care or social reproduction, to, as Ruthie puts it, building and staffing and managing prison after prison after prison, unquote. It was a clear abandonment of one set of public mandates in favor of another, of social welfare, abandoned, for domestic warfare, unquote. Gilmore's work is a masterful drawing together of the theoretical insights of Marxism and the historical documenting of racialization of a working class. Refurbishing David Harvey's concept of a spatial fix, Gilmore introduces us to the prison fix. California used prison expansion provisionally, I'm quoting Ruthie. California used prison expansion provisionally to fix, to remedy, as well as to set firmly into space the crises of land, labor, finance, capital, and state capacity. By absorbing people, issuing public debt with no public promise to pay it down, and using up land taken out of extractive production, the state also put to work many of its fiscal and organizational abilities without facing the challenges that were already mounting when the same factors of production were petitioned for, say, a new university, unquote. Gilmore's analysis is a categorical deployment of Marx's concept like factors of production and relations of production to tell the story of a capitalist state that organized such factors to shape race and class for generations, especially generations of people of color in the United States. Gilmore's words come to us laden with historic loss when she says, quote, "These factors of mass incarceration or factors of production didn't have to be organized the way they were. They could have become something else," unquote. But this loss encloses an uncompromising hope. For liberal versions of abolition politics, the solution is simply to take the road back to the welfare functions of the capitalist state, to decommodify and socialize social reproduction. So, to paraphrase Gilmore, to build more hospitals rather than prisons. This is certainly a worthy goal in the short term. For Gilmore, however, it is the social relations of capitalism that contain the logic of incarceration. As long as the defining principle of social organization remains the alienation of human labor into abstract labor, social relations will continue to produce surplus populations and hence prisons to contain them. In order for care to achieve a constitutive priority in social organizing, a thoroughgoing social transformation is needed whereby it is capital that is abolished in favor of free, conscious, purposeful activity of humanity. If SRT is a diagnostic of capitalist social relations that has unique potential to reveal both the stable procedures of capital as well as its fault lines, then abolition is its politics. SRT in itself does not point towards a solution, merely outlines the problem. It is abolition that creates the horizon of liberation, giving us a futural glimpse when care can transcend need and become a principle. We, as social reproduction feminists like me, have exercised the formulation life-making to identify the multiple ways in which human beings labor to transform nature and maintain themselves. Here, I employ the concept to understand how solidarity is immanent in capitalist social relations, alongside of and in opposition to competition. It is crucial to excavate a social reproduction theory of solidarity in order to reveal solidarity as a constant presence within capitalism, to allow us to distill those particular relations that can express it as a concrete reality rather than potential alone. So finally, let me take an example that you will all be familiar with. In the capitalist-centric story, any human being is a fragmented view, provides us with a fragmented view of social being at any given moment. So at any given moment when you enter the capitalist social relations, you're either a worker or a mother. You can't be both. So one is, let's say, a shop owner or a worker or a customer in the shop during a slice of time. They can't be all things. The shop owner is no longer a Palestinian immigrant targeted by authorities. The young black worker who works in the shop is no longer the youngest child of a single mother and one who loved to play the trombone. And the customer who came to the shop to buy cigarettes is no longer a man who had just lost his job. The customer, on a warm May evening, was called George Floyd. In a capital-centric story of that evening, George Floyd had tried to purchase commodities with a counterfeit note, which had prompted the black teen shop clerk to call the police. But what if we rewrite that moment by placing onto this violent map of conflict and death the multiple histories of social reproduction that conditioned both the space and the people? Could the outcome be different? Could the watermark of solidarity become visible? Mustafa Bayoumi and Ruth Gilmore tried to write just such a history of the moment, a history of becoming rather than being. In a piece for the New York Times, Bayoumi noted how grocery stores in poor neighborhoods are often owned by immigrant Muslim families, and in this case, which was called Cup Foods, by a Palestinian family, because large chains refused to place stores in poor neighborhood. Food activist and organizer Karen Washington, in her powerful analysis, has called such policies food apartheid. For people in these neighborhoods, access to food and hence life-making or renewal of labor power is thus severely shaped by existing social structures, which include the disproportionate targeting of Muslim-owned shops by the police. Authorities, wrote Bayoumi, often force the business owners to operate almost as an arm of the police. So in other words, they have to report because otherwise they will come down heavily simply because they're either black or Muslim. With the, these manufactured laws then extend the purview of what you understand by criminality. What about the clerk himself who called the police on George Floyd? Christopher Martin, a young black man, had been raised by a single mother in a similar neighborhood and so had immediately recognized the outside's role that the store played in social reduction. It was, he said, quote, a family, a community base, unquote. Martin had already faced the violence of the city's police when he witnessed them slam his brother against a wall as the brothers were on their way to football practice. As a clerk in Cup Foods, when he called the police on George Floyd, he was doing so because the alternative was a grim reprisal of stories of many such stores being shut down for infractions and or direct violence in the hands of the police. In the words of Ruth Gilmore, the teenager could not, quote, have that job without agreeing to be an unsworn deputy for Minneapolis police, unquote. Finally, let us take a social reproduction lens to the life that George Floyd had lived and could have lived if not violently and publicly murdered by the police. Just like the Palestinian shop owner, Floyd was a migrant to the city. He had also been raised by a single mother in Houston, where his family lived in the city's first public housing, CUNY Homes. In his brief career as a musician, Floyd rapped about his pride in this black neighborhood. But accessing housing, another key ingredient of life-making, was, just like access to food, thoroughly molded by racialized morals. Residents of CUNY Homes struggled to pay the rent, even though it was advertised as affordable by the Houston Housing Authority. Black families in particular had to provide character references and proof of secure jobs in order to find a place. So, we are not in that report in the New York Times or in the capital-centric story, we are not shown glimpses of these gendered and racialized processes of life-making that brought these people into contact with each other on that fatal summer evening. So, what would happen if these other explanatory categories were allowed to prevail? If the racialized imperatives that shaped access to food, shelter, or work were replaced by flourishing communities studded with institutions and resources of life-making, would Cup Food owners and employees have allowed the carceral state entry into their lives? Or would they have immediately recognized the similarities in life-making histories between themselves and George Floyd? My effort has been to show that subjectivity is not always a matter of individual choice or moral predilection, but is shaped by these material social relations. A feminist theory of solidarity thus has to carefully reconstruct the capillaries of social reproduction in the totality of capitalism, to expose and act upon the potential of solidarity that exists but is obscured. In his magisterial study, Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois helps us see the intricately woven relationship between social reproduction and abolition. Du Bois coined the phrase abolition democracy to talk about a range of institutions that will be needed to achieve substantive democracy, not simply a formal one. He drew inspiration from the politics of the Black Convention held in Charleston in '65, where delegates of formerly enslaved people demanded not just nominal freedom, but access to institutions and structures such as public education, housing, and a living wage to help develop their full potential as citizens. Through such nurturance of life-making, it allowed Du Bois to imagine a world, quote, where men know, where men create, where they realize themselves, and where they enjoy life, unquote. As a global solidarity movement erupted in response to George Floyd's murder, or now in response to the genocide, we saw emerge concrete political demands for healthcare, for housing, for education, and good jobs, to redirect the bloated budgets for police and arms. I like to think that in that moment of intense global solidarity, we caught a glimpse of a radical reconfiguration of capitalist social relations. I like to think we caught a glimpse of abolition democracy. Thank you.
So much for that talk. Professor Bhattacharya will entertain some questions, I'm sure. So the floor is open. Don't be shy.
Thank you so much for that. It's really, really helpful. I was really interested in your retelling of the George Floyd situation and what might have been different. And I guess I'm wondering, just for a little bit more detail about that, because so you were saying an SRT theory that looks at all the layers of race and gender would show us how things could happen differently. But when I'm thinking about the actual actors in the situation, it may very well be, and very likely is the case that this, teenage cashier feels more solidarity with George Floyd than the police. But, at the end of the day, because of the way things are structured, he wouldn't keep his job or whatever. So I guess the question is, what exactly is going to do the work here that would be different? So it's not the feelings of solidarity per se, right? Because you said what we would need is these communities of care and something studded with, that if the community was studded with all of these life-making services, that this would somehow be different. And is the idea there that just that the teenage cashier would have had alternatives to working in the store, or like what exactly would be different? I think is what I'm trying to ask about, because it doesn't seem like it's just feelings of like sympathy or relating more to someone based on race or gender, because that probably already is there.
Thank you. Yes, okay. Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So, and thank you for coming. So, what I meant to say is this. Capitalism is often seen or portrayed as this giant hegemonic system, which it is, but at every point of your situation within capitalism, that moment has a hegemonic pull, a structural pull, but also has its opposite. That is a potential of solidarity. So I was trying to show that in a structural way, but then the empirical position is this, that of course the boy felt solidarity. In fact, when he testified in court, if you follow the things, he absolutely broke down. He couldn't sleep for days. But that is the hegemonic pull of the institutions, what Ruthie said. In order to keep his job, which is wage labor, he had to act as the unsworn deputy of the Minneapolis police, right? So if we reimagine and follow these threads, and then create a community where there's no police, where there is actually the redirection of local budgets away from the cops to social services, to etc., he might still have a job, but he wouldn't feel the need to call the cops right away. If there was not a racialized landscape over there, then the owner would not be worried that as a Palestinian, his store would be closed down, right? So I am simply trying to show, the hegemonic imperative that makes people do certain things, but also if we redirect that imperative, if we change the context, then they don't have to act. And this is not a complete, we're not even talking about a complete change of capitalism. I mean, this can be achieved within capitalism. We don't have to have armed police who get 80% of a city's budget. This is just not necessary. The US does this to an extraordinary extent. I'm not sure what the Canadian statistics is. Jordy's nodding that it's about the same. But so I mean, North America doesn't have to do this. And we don't have to have socialist utopia to demand that healthcare be free, education be free, museums be free, parks be free. Those kind of things can come from taxes, and we don't need the police. I mean, the police basically do not do anything important in terms of social good. Like, they keep saying, oh, the next time, some mentally ill person does this. Actually, a social worker would be much better at orienting the mentally ill person than the cops who would probably just shoot him or her. So that was my point.
First of all, Professor, thank you very much. It was an easy to understand lecture. I come from the corporate world. As I said to you at the beginning, I've come here to learn. But as I was listening to you, the words may not be the same. I remember two things. One, when I used to work in Citibank, they had a very interesting rule. To extract more labor out of us, they would promote people from the, I don't know how to define it, but people who were not officers, make them officers, give them the title of assistant manager, so they didn't have to pay overtime. So there were many of us, I was lucky enough to be in the managerial cadre. We were putting in 14 to 16 hours a day. It was ridiculous. That's one example of how exploitation happens. The other interesting example was from Saudi Arabia, where I was taking a cab, and the cab driver said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm originally from India." He says, "Okay, then I'm going to tell you something. I'm from Pakistan. But people from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are destroying the market here." And I said, "Listen, they're not destroying the market. They're filling a need for lower wages," which they were doing. And the same rule applies here. A friend of mine, who is of Indian origin, was complaining about the 960,000 students from India who are working for below market wages. And she says, "My own sons who were born here, who are attending UFT, cannot get a job." Isn't that very exploitative? Of course, I did bring this too. I saw the first volume. I don't think I can handle it. But it's very interesting. I did look up a few things as you were speaking, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. So I read your book in 2019, was it Feminism for the 1980s? And we also had the chance to present it in Bologna with James Serruzza. So my first question is, what has changed in these years? So are you still believing in the possibility of producing crafting a feminism for the 19%?
Producing.
Like feminism for the 19%, creating sort of alliances and something that can work toward that political project. And you spoke about abolition, but if I remember well, you focus more on the problem of feminist strike in that book. So is it still the case? Do you think it's still the case that the global feminist strike can be reactivated? And finally, last question, towards the American elections this year. Yeah, I'm sorry. So as feminists, what can we do also on the translational level in order for the feminists and women and LGBTQ people in the US to feel supported in that struggle against reaction, war logics, attacks on abortion freedom? Do you have any suggestions for us in other parts of the world?
$1 million. That's the $1 million question. So thank you so much for that, and I'm sure Tithi was brilliant. Okay, so can the feminist strike be activated? Of course, I mean, there's always a possibility. But at this moment, I think we are seeing a feminist struggle. The feminist struggle, as I understand it, that feminist struggle is the global struggle for Palestine. That is absolutely a feminist struggle. When people tell me, oh, why aren't you voting for Kamala Harris? What about reproductive rights? I said, well, Palestinian women must be like supreme beings or something. Don't they have reproductive rights? Like, is it okay to just go and bomb them and they kill their babies? So the whole point of feminism for 99% was to show that a feminist struggle may or may not sometimes have avowedly feminist aims, but they are all struggles. If they are mass movements, then they all actually generate and push forward rights of gender. So, so I would not call the I would call the Palestine struggle anti-imperialist struggle, but it has absolutely elements of feminism in it, because you cannot actually be in one of these demonstrations, which I'm sure you have, and have patriarchal notions, because at every point those notions are challenged by the movement itself. So can the feminist strike be reactivated? Yes, of course. I mean, there's always that potential. But I think at the moment, as feminists, our primary job is to stop the genocide. That is our primary job above anything. Because in order to live, you have to live. So, US elections. Okay, I am not voting Kamala Harris, and obviously I'm not voting Trump, and I'm absolutely happy in my conscience doing that. But I will give you an example. Because I do not believe in voting for someone who repeatedly in all her talks have said that she is not going to withdraw 1 cent of support from Israel. Okay, this is while a genocide is ongoing. But I will give you an example. My partner's father is 90 years old and lives in California. He voted Republican all his life. He was a cop in San Diego. I don't even want to imagine things he did. But in 2008, he voted Barack Obama and then ever since then has moved further and further into thinking, and this is after he gave up being a cop. I mean, I think while he was a cop, he would never do that. He has, and I believe, for good reasons, wants to vote Kamala Harris, okay? Because for him, he has seen what Republicans do to the economy, to race, etc. And now he has several, people of color in his own family, including me. And so he just hates Trump, okay? And he wants to vote Harris. So there must be several people like that in my life, colleagues, who are not supporters of genocide, but still feel compelled to vote Harris, okay? If they're activists, then I say you have absolutely no, excuse to vote Harris. But if they're not activists, they just want to do good, right? Then what I say is, look, vote whoever you want, because where I want to see you is on the streets, because that's where we will change whatever it is that we're fighting for. The problem with the Democrats is that the Democrats tell you that voting is an alternative to street activism, okay? But what we say is actually street activism is the one that gets the goods, so vote whoever you want if you feel like it. So that is how I stand. I personally will not vote for Harris.
Sorry, follow-up question if I can.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned you touched upon partisan, and here it has been very important as a problem, and we have marched in 2000s in the last few months. And you told us that it is a feminist struggle, and I totally agree with that. But in other contexts, not particularly here, many feminists have been silenced because they are the bearer of white privilege. And as long as everything is fine and there is no criticism, then it is a feminist struggle. Whenever you touch upon the problem of, can we stand together with the Iranian women, or can we say women struggle freedom, or women like freedom, or can we just say we are not standing 100% with Hamas, and then we are silenced because we are white feminists? How can we turn this struggle and conflict and inability to be in a dialogue towards something which is bigger, and which is, we want to stop the genocide in Palestine, we want feminist liberation, we want freedom from patriarchy, exploitation, and racism, and still we don't want to support any sort of violence and terrorism. Sorry if
I think there's debate on what constitutes terrorism, and so I am not going to get into that with you because I think other people may have questions, but I think this is something that is productive dialogue within your activist community that you should be having with other folks and see how they respond. And I think there is several Palestinian feminist resources that folks can, I don't think it's just US centric. It is actually a collective called the Palestinian Feminist Collective. So I think you can access some of those resources to kind of have these productive discussions within your activist community. I don't think it's for me to sort of tell either folks in Toronto or folks anywhere except my own activist sphere how they should conduct these debates. But I just want to note that there is a debate on what constitutes terrorism.
I have a question going off one of your answers to, I think, the first question about this, how 80-something% of state budgets, or a crazy amount of state budgets, are for police and prisons, and how we might not have to fundamentally change the underlying system, like change capitalism to change that. And I kind of want to challenge you on that a little bit, because in a country like Canada and the US, that were built on the heavy exploitation of black workers and clearing out indigenous people for extractivist capital, and where profits are dependent on having a large reserve army of labor, basically unemployed people, to compete for jobs, to push down wages, and you have like property developers and landlords who really need that reserve army of labor to be policed, basically keeping people off the streets and stuff. Can it be argued that in order to continue these profits and to continue Canadian and North American, like Canadian and US capitalism, we actually do need to spend massive amounts of state budgets on the police and prisons?
I agree with you completely, given the historical context. Absolutely, no disagreement. What I was arguing is, and what I was saying is that, can education be free? Can healthcare be free? What I'm arguing is these are possible within capitalist states. Okay, may not be possible without massive struggle in North America, but I am saying that them per se, these are social democratic demands. These do not have to be fully, we don't have to have full socialism and transcending the wage-labor relation in order to have free healthcare, in order for the police not to be armed, in order police departments not to have tanks, okay? These are, my town has 100,000 people. About 60,000 of them are employed in the university. My police department has a tank. Why? Right? So what I'm saying is the horizon of possibility is even possible within capitalism, not even to, sort of go beyond it. But you're right that in certain capitalist states are more armed to the teeth than others, right? But I'm just talking about the theoretical possibility that these can be possible within a capitalist system, maybe not possible in the US, etc., but maybe possible with the kind of struggle that we saw of George Floyd, who managed to burn down the Minneapolis police station, right? So if that struggle were allowed to sort of spread or move into the workplace where strikes followed in order to defend the BLM, then maybe we would see some de-escalation of budgets, but it didn't happen. So this is sort of, I'm merely talking about the theoretical possibility, that it's possible within capitalism. Many states have them. And those are not socialist states, they are capitalist states, which has free healthcare or free education.
I have a question about, first, thank you, it was amazing. I have a question about the link between reproductive labor and incarceration and the expansion of the carceral state, because you cited Gilmore, and her work also actually started with the families of incarcerated people, so people who are doing the care work for people who are inside the prison. So, two questions. How can we think or theorize reproductive labor when people are actually doing care work for the state? Because the state takes people inside institutions and then they put them in very precarious conditions, and then the families have kind of to do this work of care and like supporting people incarcerated. And the same for people who are victims of state violence and then end up with like any forms of disability, and then again the families are doing. And how can we think about this type of reproductive labor that's not surplus value, is not like for the production like of workers or for your family, but it's actually to kind of like take care of what the state destroyed.
Right. So again, I think that's a wonderful point. Thank you for raising it. So we have to go back to what I said, that each moment is that as well as its opposite, right? So that's an extreme case we're talking about. But even when I am bringing up my child, right, I am, teaching her all about social justice and so on and so forth, and, but I'm also preparing her for the capitalist job market, right? So each moment of care is also its reverse, right? So both of those positions stay braided in each of the moments of capital. So in your case, which is the extreme case, yes, the mama might be, caring for the person who lost his legs because of police violence, but that is also a moment of taking food to the incarcerated person, but that is also a moment of resistance, that it refuses that this person should stay constantly. In fact, the mama is regenerating hope, so both of those situations, it is assisting, as it were, incarceration by keeping them alive, but it is also a refusal to accept incarceration by constantly organizing networks of hope and activism. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have two questions. First one, and then the other.
Hi, thank you so much for that. It's been so amazing to see this SRT develop over the last 10 years. And it's just a wonderful talk. I just have a kind of a bit of a quibble or a question, maybe if I'm understanding or not understanding the metaphor you use, both in the title of the talk and in how you came from SRT to abolition. If SRT is a diagnostic, and I'm not sure if I'm quoting you correctly, that SRT doesn't present a solution, we need to abolition. Not that I disagree with that, but is abolition, or what Jaffe calls the socialist horizon, isn't it always already implicit in SRT?
Yes, but you can argue that SRT, some of the demands of SRT can certainly be practiced by the state, by reformist organizations. This is to go back to the comrade's question here, that we can have wonderful free hospitals, free schools, we can have Scandinavia, but still, so fulfilling most of the SRT functions, but still in Norway, for instance, you have, I'm not saying that is the politics of SRT, but yes, abolition is enclosed in SRT, that you cannot have the wage capital relations and have a human being develop in the full potential of their labor power. So that is absolutely true. So that the capitalist relation has to be abolished in order for SRT to reach its full potential, or not SRT, but the human being to reach their full potential. What I am talking about here is SRT by itself. It's a diagnostic and it is a horizon. All of that is true. But abolition in recent years has shown us concrete politics in terms of strategy to achieve SRT, or some of the things that we're talking about, right? So it's more of the strategy, if you like, and rather than simply, but SRT is definitely the diagnostic, and so the politics, by politics I mean the strategies and the ideas that they include. Does that make sense, Jordy?
Absolutely. I think that, so just to follow up, what was said before about the feminism for the 99%, so this is a conjunctural with how you're articulating SRT.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the great talk. I also had two questions. One kind of on the dark side of labor power and one on the hopeful stuff. The first one, I was wondering how you would think about prison labor in this matrix that you've painted out, and how you see it fitting into the circuits of production and valorization, but also struggle and potentials of solidarity and all of this stuff that you've been painting out, especially when we think about prisons already as like commodifying humans, but then also now commodifying human labor power as well through the circuits of prison labor. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But then I was also thinking about the second half or the end of your talk about the politics of solidarity, and it really made me think of this essay by Angela Davis, not about prisons, but about housework. You know, like when she's critiquing Federici and Della Costa about the Wages for Housework campaign. And she's saying, you know, Davis argues, well, we don't actually want wages for housework. Like housework under capitalism is alienating, it's uncreative, it's miserable. And nobody, a house husband or a housewife, nobody should have to do it whether you get paid or not. Instead, we need to collectivize it. We need to think about massive like socialization of social reproduction and like collectivized ways to do housework. So I really love that argument, and I always show it to my students when they're feeling very depressed about things. So I'd love to see how would you put her argument like in dialogue with the politics of solidarity and abolition. I think they could work. I think they would work really nice together. And yeah, if you have any reflections or thoughts on that.
So prison labor is horrible, and just like prisons themselves, and but they don't produce value. So that's all I would say. And you know, I think we need to abolish prisons in order to abolish that kind of thing, because it's kind of a self-defeating thing, because as long as we have prisons, the prisoners will be employed to do backbreaking, you know, building roads and cleaning motorways, which I find really upsetting. Anyhow, I completely agree with Angela Davis. I mean, one of the examples I always give about social reproduction is that, you know, we actually have communal kitchens, okay, where the food is cooked by others for the community to eat, except these communal kitchens are for the rich. They're called restaurants. So instead of that being restaurants, we could have one in each neighborhood where we, irrespective of gender, take turns to cook. And, you know, that way that food would be free and available to all. So yes, I completely agree with Angela Davis that housework should be by choice only, not as a necessity. So one of the questions I always face when I do SRT talks is, but do you want to abolish kitchens? Okay, and this is something that, you know, Alexandra Kollontai apparently always had. Like, do you want to abolish kitchens? No, I don't want to abolish kitchens. I just want to abolish the mind-numbing necessity to cook every day. What I want my kitchen for is when you come to dinner, that I cook a lovely meal for you, okay? Because I am good at it. But if you come to dinner on a day that I don't want to cook a lovely meal, I don't feel I have to, okay? And so socialism is all about choice, okay? Socialism is not about, you know, these straight-laced Stalinists telling you what to do. Socialism is all about choice. And so if you evacuate the home of labor in this manner, then the home becomes, Kollontai's essay, Winged Eros, is so beautiful because it's saying something of, it's not about labor per se, it's about love and relationships, but it's the same, that it is, we are straitjacketed into what we do at home. Instead, the home should be a place where we employ these choices to build beautiful relationships.
Can I just, if you don't mind?
There's
you
another.
have people. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really interested in your work in general also. So my question is, I guess, like not as broad as other people's. I hope it makes sense. But I wanted to ask, like you're also a historian, so I just wanted to ask, in your reflections and in your work, have you, like, how do we use, like, obviously, like the way that, you know, social reproduction is conceived is for the worker, and so we trace it back to industrialization and so on and so forth. But I'm really interested in how we can think of how social reproduction worked in, for example, the colonial context. The colonial context, right? So, because like a lot of this discussion is about contemporary and like a hopefully anti-capitalist future and how we can do that. But I just you know, like, I don't know if this makes a lot of sense, but I just think of like how we can also understand the peculiarity of the colonial condition through concepts such as social reproduction, and how women were specifically impacted by, the colonial, I would just say colonial condition. So I'm asking you this because you're also a historian, so like, just like how in your work you might have also used this concept to understand some aspect of colonial history. If that makes sense.
Colonialism is part of how capitalism expresses itself. So all the things that I said about capitalist social relations also work for the colonial situation, except in one particular way, which is, capitalism is a lot of capitalist states, but it is also interstate rivalry. So what I talked about with the toothpaste, so these are marketplace rivalries, right? But there is also interstate competition at a global level, and that's where colonialism is a part in a way. So it's not strictly about social reproduction as well, but when you are studying social reproduction relationships within, say, South Asia, you have to keep in mind that these relations operate not just in the sort of specific borders of South Asia, but South Asia has been pulled into the global market unwillingly and in an unequal relationship to Britain or France. So that's kind of, so in that sense, it's not strictly about social reproduction, but you have to understand capitalism as a totality in order to understand that some states fare better than others, and that also maintains this equilibrium, just like the value maintains equilibrium in the market sense.
We have time for one more question, and then we can do Professor Bhattacharya.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for your talk. And like most of your audience, I have more than one question. Just stop me when it becomes too much. But so one of the ways Jordan was talking earlier about, some of the different ways that social reproduction theory has grown and developed and reinvented itself in recent years. And for me, one of those directions is the kind of conversation going on within transgender Marxism. So I wonder if you want to come in on the whole question of, social reproduction theory has been so important for feminists, in good part because it gives us a particular kind of gendered account of why capitalist social relations look like they do, the division of labor and whatnot. But other people have found it heteronormative or unable to kind of account, for certain kinds of things we need to get to. So I'm wondering how you might want to queer it, what ways you might want to, how it also might help us reconceive the domestic, right? Because sometimes when people talk about, well, what might be the kinds of care institutions we need to invent, it doesn't kind of get down to the ways of rethinking and reimagining sexuality, gender, kinship, the family, household. So I'd love more of your thoughts on how you see that. And also the question of sexual labor, where you would place it within another site where there's been a lot of kind of debate and back and forth is how you would locate sexual labor within this kind of conversation. And finally, Jordy was talking earlier about your title talk and your commentary that social reproduction theory is a kind of diagnostic and abolition provides us with a politic. But one of the most interesting essays in the book that you edited is, in fact, some of the historical essays, right, that talk about struggles at the site of social reproduction, how they've changed. And for me, there's a whole heritage of things to learn from that set of questions, right? So I'm not totally with you that social reproduction theory can only provide a particular kind of diagnostic, because it seems to me that the world we have now is an outcome of particular kinds of historical struggles, right? At all of these sites, from which I think we can learn a lot that can also be taken up in the context of abolition feminism as well, right? And abolition democracy. So I'd love your thoughts thoughts just on any and all of those questions and more. Thank you.
Thank you. So transgender. So I'm here to talk about social reproduction theory. And so how does the theory make sense of anything? So the theory is about the reproduction of labor power, but common sense Marxism says labor power is reproduced. But social reproduction feminism says labor power is reproduced in very specific ways that are gendered, queered, racialized, or result of imperialism or colonialism, and so on. So theoretically, of course, then the production of labor power relies on, there is no simple route to the production of labor power. The reproduction of labor power relies on racialized, gendered, and queered social relations in order to come to the market, as it were. So that would be social reproduction theories. In terms of what kind of can you want to imagine, my answer is simply that the struggle will decide. I think I am not here to provide blueprints, but I think we have a lot to learn from our trans siblings who have actually upended the notion of family in very, very productive ways, and has given us a glimpse of what the future could be like, right? So, or at least some aspects of the future could be like. So, but that is the kind of the outcome of struggles and of historical developments. I don't think social reproduction theory is equipped to tell you how to struggle, but social reproduction theory can tell you that these kind of choices will result if you're talking about the full flourishing of human life. Okay, you cannot have the full flourishing of human life in all its potential if you say, well, you're a trans person, so that really isn't part of this collective idea, right? So that's not even bigoted, that's just illogical, because it does not have, because frankly, I am excited to see what the full flourishing of human life looks like, because I don't think it's going to be limited to one set of identities or another. It's going to be something that we haven't seen before or imagined before, and it is our job to always demand that possibility of infinite choice.
With that, I think we should thank our speaker.